Before we officially start, I'd like to welcome Jimmy Williams, who's the president and CEO of the Washington Literary Center, who we partner with frequently, to give a few remarks.
I think it's fair to say good evening. And first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. And I can tell you, I was here a couple of years ago, and that's the first time that I met Keisha Blain. And she's had several books since then. And I can tell you, I've been talking back and forth with her people for well over a year. It's been a pleasure knowing her, just seeing the movement, and especially in these political times that we live in now. I look at the title of the book, Without Fear, Black Women and the Making of Human Rights. Well, we are in that window where it's Black women and the remaking of human rights. And Keisha's book is very timely. So I mentioned I'm president and CEO of the Washington Literacy Center. We are about adult literacy, but we're also about empowerment through literacy. We're located at 1133 15th Street Northwest. But we teach adults to read. We teach adults math and reading skills. And there is a perfect blending of what Keisha does and the spirit that she does it and the empowerment of the books that she does. And our gift is to make it possible for people to read and embody and understand all that Keisha Blain does. Now, before I move on so that we can introduce what you're really here for, I also like to recognize we have one of our former board chairs here. Daniel, please stand up. We have our COO here. Vernon, please stand up. Now, together, we're dedicated people, and like I said, I can't be more happy that when Keisha asked us to introduce us, because we've been following her for the longest time from when she was sitting up here with Donna Brazil and a couple of other people. So all I can say is people like this are the real deal. Thank you very much for coming. And I'll ask you, if you live in the Washington, D.C. area, you see me standing around, please support the Washington Literacy Center, because again, when you're talking about human rights, reading is a basic human right, and that's something that has been taken and stolen from us time and time again. And books like this, you know, they would love to suppress books like this. And so join us in that battle, join Keisha in that battle, support her book, and support the Washington Literacy Center. Thank you.
Today we're joined by Professor Keisha Blain and Glory Edim, to discuss Professor Blain's new book, Without Fear, Black Women and the Making of Human Rights. Without Fear outlines Black women's often erased history as civil and human rights leaders, accounting their aspirations, strategies, and struggles to combat systems of oppression both domestically and internationally. Professor Keisha Blain is a professor of Africana Studies and History at Brown University. She currently has 3 different fellowships and is a National Book Critic Award finalist, among many things that I simply don't have the time to name. She'll be in discussion today with Glory Edim, who's the founder of Well Read Black Girl and is an advocate for diverse voices in literature. Please join me in welcoming Professor Keisha Blain and Glory Edim today.
Hello, everyone. It is such an honor to have you here today. How are you feeling?
Good. Very excited.
Your book is so amazing. It's full of history. I found myself just discovering so many new things that I thought I knew, but you go deeper and share so much of your wonderful research. I'm going to jump into this conversation with some questions to talk about your process, craft, and your role as a historian. So I'm going to repeat some words back to you. In the introduction, you open with, women of all nationalities can come together without fear and hesitancy, secure in the knowledge that they meet as equals and as workers striving together. We can think together and coordinate for the greater benefit of mankind. And that quote is from Mary Bethune. And I found it's a perfect opening for this subject because you really take this book from U.S. history across the diaspora and show the contributions of Black women. Can you tell us why you started with that quote and why you decided to have this be the subject of this book?
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And thank you all for coming out this evening. There's so much I can say. I will admit to you that I was not entirely sure what the book title would be, uh, pretty much up until the 11th hour. And as many of you can imagine, when you're writing a book and you're going through the process of working with multiple different people behind the scenes, it sometimes requires a bit of negotiations and back and forth before you all agree on many things, including the title. And so I initially thought I would call the book A Global Struggle. And the publicity team, the marketing team said, you need something a little better. And I thought, well, what's wrong with the global struggle? That sounds perfect. So they said, well, go back to the book and maybe see if you can find something that really captures the message of this book, the argument of the book, in a more robust and lively, interesting way. So that set me on a path of rereading the book over and over again, looking for something that would stick. And when I saw that quote, I just stopped there and I thought, okay, this is it. I reached out to the team and said, what do you think? And they said, this is it. So we were on the same page. But it's so perfect because it comes from a quote, as you said, from Mary McLeod Bethune. And she's saying this in the 1940s. She's speaking to a group of Black women, and she's essentially saying to them, we can, in fact, lead this fight for human rights, and we can do so by forging collaborations and solidarities transnationally. And I think it's so important because the phrase without fear and hesitancy, I think sometimes when we talk about the history, we talk about this kind of work, we imagine that the people who did this work, they were fearless. We say that sometimes. And there is some truth to that. But I also think it is important to emphasize the fear, to emphasize the fact that these women were trying to advocate for human rights at a moment where they were not even recognized as full citizens of the United States. And I mean that, especially, again, this is the 1940s, before the passage of the Civil Rights Act, before the passage of the Voting Rights Act, just to name a few. And so to tell these women we can do so without fear, I could just imagine them in the room. I could imagine what it meant for them to hear those words. And it just inspired me. And I thought that it would be important to really start there, to pick up the book, to imagine what it must have been for these women, and then to imagine what it means for you in this current difficult political climate. What does it mean to be an advocate for human rights, and what does it mean to do so without fear and hesitancy? So it really came together powerfully. And in so many ways, as I explained in the book, Mary McLeod Bethune is truly one of the best people to say this. We hopefully we'll talk more about her, but truly remarkable in the kind of work that she did and the way that she broke barriers and opened doors for so many.
Yeah. You know, your book really spans more than a century of activism, and you highlight figures that are very well known, and then also some that are lesser known that really illuminate their contributions. One such person that I had to take a pause and really do my own research because I was so intrigued was Maria W. Stewart, who became one of the first Black women to publish political essays. Mm-hmm. And I think about, we read the New York Times, we read all these, incredible publications that highlight the work of Black women such as yourself. I think of Nicole Hannah-Jones, so many people, yet here was one of the first, right? Can you talk about how you chose to select the women you highlighted, and how did you navigate this balance between someone who might be lesser known, like a Maria W. Stewart, versus Mary McLeod Bethune?
Yeah, so one of the things that happens as I'm writing a book is that I have a very clear sense of what I want to accomplish, but I'm also fairly open and flexible because it's very important to, at least the way that I do things, it's very important to follow the sources. And it's very important to grapple with the complexities too. So when I first mapped out the project, I thought I would start in 1865 with the end of the Civil War, and I thought, well, this would be a story about emancipation, and I would look forward and then take it all the way to the present moment. I started doing that. And as I was writing the first chapter and talking about Ida B. Wells, I realized that I couldn't actually do the story justice if I didn't take a step back to talk about Mariah Stewart from the 1830s as the first documented Black woman who spoke publicly to mixed race audiences, who spoke publicly to men and women. And what's interesting about Mariah Stewart's story is that not only was she someone who spoke boldly about human rights, as I talk about in the book, without necessarily using the phrase, but emphasizing the core values of human rights. So thinking about equality, thinking about universal rights, thinking about the God-given protections that every person should have, regardless of their race, regardless of their gender, regardless of their ethnicity, and so on. What's interesting about Mariah Stewart is that we see her as a writer, certainly. We see her as someone who's speaking publicly. And then there's a moment in the book where, I suspect people will pause here as they're reading about her, where I talk about how she's so influential, she's so powerful in the demands that she's making, but her career is short-lived. Why? Because she decides, really, for her own protection, to pull away from public life. And that was a moment where I remember, just as I was writing and reflecting on that, and understanding it. I think to my earlier point about courage, about fearlessness, we often do talk about these attributes, but what about when the person just comes to the moment where they just say, I've had enough. I'm tired of the abuse. I'm tired of the attacks. I'm tired of the threats of violence and so on. And I think that's what it was for her, that she knew there were people who did not appreciate what she had to say because she was a woman speaking at a time where women were seen as the ones who should simply focus on home and family and not necessarily be engaged in public political discourse. And then other people who didn't think she should be speaking as a Black woman. And then remember that we're talking about the 1830s. So there are so many at the time, especially, of course, primarily throughout the South, who are enslaved. And you have this Black woman in Boston calling out folks for the way that they are supporting this degrading system. And she's saying, this is wrong, this is immoral. And so I think her story was important because then it helped to contextualize an Ida B. Wells. Yeah. Fast forward to the late 19th century, then you can understand, you see the links, not only intellectually, but in terms of the strategy, and then in terms of the challenges that persist as we move forward. Many things change, but so many things remain the same. And so I did not plan on talking about Mariah Stewart, but I felt compelled to in the process of writing.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate that because it just showed your intentionality and just the breadth of the contributions of Black women across time, history, and there were some people that immediately I recognized and I had studied before, like Amy Garvey and Claudia Jones, and you also highlight so many global thinkers. Can you talk about how internationalism really shapes Black women's human rights and their activism, especially in the mid-20th century?
Yes, this is something that I really wanted to capture, and it's something I've been thinking about for a long time. I think anyone who's followed my work, my first book, Set the World on Fire, looks at Black nationalist women's political activism in both the national and global context. I'm always interested in transnational political and social movements. What's so interesting, I think, is as I was writing my previous book on Fannie Lou Hamer, and we all, I think, generally understand Fannie Lou Hamer through the lens of the American Civil Rights story. We talk about her in 1964. We talk about her powerful speech at the Democratic National Convention. We talk about her as an advocate for voting rights. And as I was writing that book, I felt compelled to include a chapter on Hamer's internationalism because I learned a lot in the process of doing research. I didn't even realize that she had traveled to Guinea in the same year, in '64. I didn't realize how that visit had transformed her, how it broadened her political consciousness, and it helped her think in a more transnational, global sense. And so I tried to capture that in that book. But as I was doing it, I felt that it was important to tell a larger story, one that would bring together women from diverse political perspectives, to show how much this international aspect of Black women's activism was very much central in some ways from the very beginning. And this is not, I think this is not a light thing. I actually think this is a very important point to emphasize, because it's not that we shouldn't care about the civil rights movement. Absolutely, we should. And it's not that we shouldn't talk about national politics. But there's a way in which I think the overemphasis on the national story shields the larger story of how Black women were always looking to forge transnational political solidarities, the way that they were really tapping into a global discourse about rights, liberation, the way that they were not only drawing from what was happening externally, but they were also influencing what was happening externally. And hope maybe we'll have time to talk about someone like Margaret Cartwright as someone who's traveling overseas, moving back and forth, and attending events like the 1955 Bandung Conference, coming back and then writing a series of articles for a Black American audience in which she's talking about the meaning of Bandung for Black people. Really remarkable kinds of activism. And I think those kinds of narratives are often overlooked because we are spending so much time talking about that struggle for citizenship, right? Trying to push against the mistreatment of Black people within the American context. All of that matters, but I think it's important to really grapple with the way that these women are in fact part of an international story, how they are part of a global dialogue, and in some ways it amplifies their voices in significant ways. So I hope certainly that this book will help people see that in very concrete ways.
Absolutely. As you were talking, I literally turned to chapter 5, where, you talk about that group of Black activists gathering in Ghana and having this monumental moment where there is this like intellectual debate, and it just expands viewpoints in such a beautiful way. Can you talk about just how that intersectionality is central to these women's approaches when they're talking about it, whether in a public setting or within like the confounds of just their intimate lives, right? You can see how these meetings change their interior dialogue with themselves and how they represent Black womanhood. And I use the word intersectionality because that was happening before the term even existed, right? Yes. So how do they articulate or act upon these ideas while they were traveling and while they were still holding these titles as such as mother and these figures as wives in the same time? Like, it's no small feat to carry all those identities at once.
Absolutely. And as I just referenced the case of Margaret Cartwright, and it's probably the perfect example to demonstrate this. So for many who are unfamiliar, this is African-American journalist and sociologist. She's a professor in the 1950s and 1960s, a columnist. She writes for the Pittsburgh Courier. She also writes for New York, Amsterdam News. And Margaret Cartwright is someone who most people have not heard of, yet what's so interesting about her story is that she was such a pivotal role behind the scenes, especially when it came to connecting individuals. I mentioned the 1958 conference in Accra, Ghana. In the book, I open up chapter 5 with this scene. It's certainly a familiar moment for historians. Many will talk about the 1958 All African Peoples Conference as this critical space where, of course, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, he's overseeing this. He's collaborating with several others. It's a space for Black intellectuals across the globe to come together and talk about bringing an end to colonialism. It's truly this pivotal moment. But what many people don't necessarily reflect on is the fact that it is a male-dominated space. And by one account, there are about maybe 8 women present at this gathering. Those who are involved in the official proceedings are men. Those who others write about are men, right? And then historians focus on the men. And then you have someone like Margaret Cartwright who's present. No one necessarily sees her, cares about her presence, but she's so pivotal because what she does is she's moving in these spaces, she's building relationships. So that's one thing. She's meeting people, she's connecting with people, and that later proves beneficial because, as I talk about in the book, at one point she is connecting Kwame Nkrumah to Martin Luther King Jr. Yeah. And she wants to make sure that Dr. King is able to participate in the celebrations around Ghana's independence, and she's the person making that connection behind the scenes. And her presence at that 58 gathering is one way that she's able to do these kinds of things. She's taking notes, and then she goes back and she writes a series of columns in which she's explaining from her point of view the significance of this gathering for Black people. And she's saying to them, we have to pay attention to what's happening in Accra, Ghana, because this is tied to our own struggle in the US context. If we're going to make demands of the state, all of that is important, but we need to think about this global narrative. We need to think about human rights, and we need to think about what's happening in Accra as we think about what needs to happen in Mississippi, what needs to change in the United States. And so I talk about her just to show the way that Black women, because they are largely shut out of these traditional spaces or these formal halls of power, so to speak, how they still find ways to assert their political power. And it's so remarkable. I even get into her personal life a little bit, as much as the evidence allows, because there's only so much you can know about a person. But I get into her letters in which she talks about just what it means. And there's a moment where she's writing this very tense letter in which she's telling someone, listen, I am still a professor, let's not get it twisted. I'm doing my work. I am still teaching my classes. I'm making my meetings. And she's trying to explain, I'm making these trips, but I'm doing it during the breaks, and I chuckle because I don't know the backstory there, but I suspect she's just dealing with the resistance of people talking about her and maybe feeling like she's not doing what she should do. And she's emphasizing, her commitment to her husband. You just see how all of these concerns come together for her, and she's shouldering so many different responsibilities. And to your larger question about the identities, and you see the way that intersectionality unfolds through these women's lives long before the term becomes one that we circulate, I think, in everyday conversation.
I just want to keep expanding on the identities because there's so much that you reference, whether it's around religion or motherhood or even the preliminary steps of community organizing. They all play critical points of literally every single person you mentioned, whether it's like Lena Horne or Madam T.J. Walker or Scholar, right? They all have these moments where they rub against that. Can you expand on how they weave together personal identity and public activism? And perhaps we can use Lena Horne as an example or another person that you featured within the book.
Yes, I think one of the women who I talk about in chapter 3, who's another woman who's not well known, but someone I've been very interested in for a long time, is a woman by the name of Pearl Sherrod. And she's a working class, or you might say working poor, Black woman from Detroit. And I talk about how she's really grappling with human rights as a concept, how she's trying to advocate for human rights at the grassroots level, and how she does so with very few material resources and without a lot of support. One of the things that I think becomes quite clear is just the way that her own individual experience, and to your question, her personal experience, how it shapes the way that she thinks about human rights and talks about it. By the time we get to about 1937, she's a single mom. There's a long and complicated story that I talk about in the book, but at that point, her husband abandons her. She's raising her young kids on her own, and she's trying to make ends meet. And in some ways, just the experience of having to deal with poverty, just the experience of having to face these concerns, what we talk about are these bread and butter issues, the experience itself ultimately, I think, shapes the way that she conceptualizes human rights. And so what she does is in 1937, she shows up in this Pan-Pacific Women's Conference that's taking place in Vancouver, Canada. And part of it is she's trying to break down these walls. There's a group of women there, white women, Asian women, who are having these grand conversations about rights, about liberation, about unity, justice. Wonderful terms, meaningful terms. And what Pearl Sherrod does is she enters the space. She's not invited. She ultimately crashes the party when you think about it. She shows up, she walks to the front, and she just starts speaking. And one of the things that she's talking about to these women is she's saying, listen, even if you think you are involved in this important work around justice, around women's rights, none of that matters if you're not going to grapple with the concerns that Black people are dealing with. And so it is about economic rights, too. It is about dealing with economic injustice. She also says, it's about dealing with racial violence. Yeah. She starts talking about lynching. And this is a moment that is captured in the archive where people are writing about how this woman just shows up and she shifts the narrative, right? She's an uninvited guest, but she leaves such a powerful impact. And what I talk about is in the aftermath, the group decides to open up a space for Black women to come, for Black women to be part of the dialogue. So it seems like a small thing, an ordinary person whose name most people have never heard of, yet she leaves such a powerful impact. And the impact she leaves is very much tied to the fact that she's experiencing so much as a Black woman, as a working poor Black woman in Detroit, and that informs her vision of human rights, and she's able to articulate it in very compelling ways. And it's a remarkable story, and one that I hope more people will know.
I'm so excited and just grateful that you're sharing these examples. And when you all read, you will be extremely moved and want to do your own research. I just found myself writing down so many names and going to JSTOR and looking up things. Your research is really, really in-depth and thorough, and has this balance of advocating and storytelling and historian. It's all of it just she paints a really clear picture of your work and your dedication. Can you talk about how you were, excuse me, and you have to correct me if I'm wrong with this, but I did feel like you were reframing the civil rights movement as part of like the broader human rights struggle. Was this a distinction you were trying to make? And if so, why was that especially significant to Black women's activism?
So I think one of the things that I found not frustrating, but perhaps somewhat limiting, was the way that so many of the books on Black women's political activism in the US is very much about this emphasis on Black women and certainly Black people broadly being treated as second-class citizens. That is true. But part of what I think ended up being missed in the process of emphasizing this so much is that actually many of these activists were making a larger claim, and that was the claim that Black people were actually not being treated as human at all. So there's that, and emphasizing that particular point, but also emphasizing that the demand isn't for, well, the U.S. needs to live up to its promises. Let's talk about the Constitution. Let's talk about the Reconstruction Amendments. I'm not suggesting that we don't. I'm not suggesting that these things don't matter. But there's a way in which the overemphasis on trying to get the United States to live up to its expectations, to do exactly what we're supposed to do for Black people based on what's written. And these women are making a claim that's so powerful, and quite frankly, one could say it's the kind of claim that transcends the written text, which is say, no, we already have protections, and it's not what you think you wrote in the Constitution. It actually existed long before that, because these are divinely inspired. Now, not all of these women are religious. Not all of these women have the same views. They come from various backgrounds, different faiths, etc. But it's the idea that what is fundamental to human rights is that they do not come from individuals. It's not about necessarily what's written in the law. but it's acknowledging that there are protections that are guaranteed to all people, regardless of where they are located, regardless of who they are, regardless of their age, religion, and so on. And it becomes a very powerful argument to make, one that doesn't necessarily ignore the national context, doesn't necessarily ignore the demand for voting rights, but says, you know what, it's much bigger than that. And when you withhold these things, you're withholding much more. Yes. And so it is about reframing the story so that in a way we understand the magnitude of it. One might say we understand the global implications of it, and then we understand why these women were propelled to reach out beyond the physical borders of the United States.
You know, earlier it was said that your book is timely, and I couldn't agree more that this subject matter feels so valuable. And I would love for you to expand on the lessons that you think Without Fear can support young activists, how it resonates with movements happening today, whether that's in a racial context or gender. Like, how does this research and your book really continue to push forward this very future forward thinking?
Well, I think oftentimes when we talk about history, there's a couple of things that I would say. When we talk about history, it's very easy to fall into the trap of believing that it's always about progress. It's always about forward momentum. There is certainly some progress. There is certainly some forward momentum. But what is clear when you read the book, and that's why I thought about that earlier title, A Global Struggle, it really is a struggle. It's an ongoing struggle. And to imply struggle is to say that sometimes you do win and sometimes you lose. Sometimes you move forward and sometimes you move backward. It's important to remember that, especially in this moment, because if the assumption is that you're always moving forward and that's the only time that you think things are shifting, then you grow very discouraged very quickly and you assume nothing's actually changing when it seems like steps are being made in the opposite direction. But part of it is understanding that all of it is part of the process, and that may not be reassuring. But at the same time, I think knowing it matters so that we don't fall into a trap of imagining, and we actually don't fall into a trap of saying things like, this is an unprecedented moment. We've never seen anything like it. People love saying this, but actually it's not true. And so if you at least acknowledge that, it just helps to navigate the moment. That's one thing. But the other thing, too, is thinking about the responses to the challenges. I love writing about grassroots activists. I love writing about, I love telling the story from the bottom up. And it's not to suggest that what happens at the top doesn't matter. Like, all of that certainly matters. But I love just zooming in on the individual, the person who might not have a title or might not have certain kinds of power or seemingly having certain kinds of power. And I love doing that because I think it sends a larger message to all of us about the power that we hold even when we don't think we have power. Yeah. And also the way that we are able to affect change even when we don't have all the things we think we need to affect change. It's sometimes the small act. It's working within your sphere of influence. You simply can't fix every problem at every particular moment, but there's something you can do, and you see it in these women's stories. They're not spectators. Yeah. They're very intentional, and they use a range of strategies. They use whatever resources they have to try to make a difference. And more importantly, they don't do it alone. So that's one thing that I would emphasize to everyone. Don't try to do it alone. Really tap into the networks, the communities, the groups that would really, I think, not only provide support as you're going through this, but quite frankly, great ideas emerge when people come together and collaborate. So there's a lot of lessons, but those are the ones I would emphasize.
I would love to talk some more about your research process. One of my favorite things were the photos you included. One of them was of journalist Cartwright with President Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria. And I don't know if you know this, but I'm Nigerian, and my son is named after Azikiwe.
Okay.
And so I was just like, oh my gosh, like there were so many
Yeah.
things that I've, again, like your research in terms of finding people like the legal scholar, Patricia Roberts Harris, like there were just so many incredible photos that I had not seen in my research when I'm looking up incredible people and just trying to learn. Can you talk about that? And if there were any kind of like personal moments where you were surprised or you found it, like I know you've been in historian for a long time. Do these things still give you like a sense of joy or illuminate like,
They
oh,
do.
I've never seen this, you
They
know?
do. They do. And I chuckled about this, to myself as I was doing the research, getting so excited about little things and thinking, okay, I really am doing exactly what I was meant to do because I'm getting way too excited about this one little document. But it's so rewarding, especially. So I mentioned Pearl Sherrod. So Pearl Sherrod is someone I've been thinking about for a while. I discovered her when I was writing my dissertation. So now more than 10 years ago. And yet I found a ton of new information about her this time around. And I thought, wow, like how remarkable. I thought I had found everything I could find about this woman. And then fast forward, I'm finding more. And as I'm going through the records one more time, I'm seeing her in new ways. And it's such a remarkable experience. So there's a lot that I learned in the process of writing the book. So that felt good. It was both being able to delve into topics that I felt that I knew very well, but also having to pause and say, okay, wait a minute, this is new, and having to slow down and just read a little bit more to understand the larger context, to figure out how this would connect to the story that I was telling. So it is a process. I mentioned earlier, just being open. I think that's key. And I say this to my students too. I say it's good to have a plan, it's good to have a proposal. You certainly should have an argument, but you have to be willing to shift. Especially, even if you have an argument in mind, if all the evidence is pointing to something else that's countering your argument, you don't push it aside and say, well, that's not helping. Let's find what's helping. And there you go. No, it's time to alter the argument. Right. Absolutely. And, enrich the argument. And so it is something that I had to do in the process. And so, yes, lots of new discoveries and perhaps to a point I made earlier, collaboration. You'll see I have an acknowledgement section. It's very important to me. Because as I was writing the book, just talking to others, sharing chapters with other scholars, and having someone say to me, wait a minute, I found something when I was doing research on this other person, and it relates to something you said. Take a look at this. Like, just amazing. Those kinds of things really enrich the narrative, and it reinforces my point earlier about the importance of collaboration and working with people and not doing it alone. So yes, it really was a rewarding experience. And there was a review of my book that I read recently, in which someone said something like, the book, I think they said something like, all of these women that she talks about deserve a book of their own. And I was like, yes, absolutely. And I'm not going to be able to write those books, but I do hope that they inspire others. I hope that grad students, others are picking it up, reading and saying, oh, okay, I can pursue this. And hopefully I've given them enough leads so they could push the story to another level. So that's my hope for sure.
Yeah, that is the feeling I left with as well. I have already I'm gifting this book to so many people that are studying history, anthropology, who are just simply curious. So I feel like it is doing that work. Can we expand on that idea about, again, growing it, having students feel like they have the accessibility to the information, and how can institutions, whether that's museums, schools, media, better honor the legacies of these women?
Well, to this point, I will say that this is a very critical moment, and I think we all know this, but I was reflecting on this just recently because I was talking earlier about Margaret Cartwright, and I rely heavily on her papers. They're at the Amistad. There are some papers at Harvard, but I relied heavily on the collection at the Amistad Research Center at Tulane in New Orleans. And so just a couple weeks ago, I was just reading the newspaper and saw the story that the Amistad Research Center lost millions, just lots of money. You can already guess, right, from the federal government, just gone. And so they've been in the process of they had to let go staff, and I remember just sitting there thinking, wow, will this even be available in 10 years for another set of researchers to be able to write these kinds of books? I certainly hope so, but it's only going to be possible if we ensure that we support these institutions. So it does require, I think, an intentionality on our part to make sure that places like the Amistad Research Center and other collections remain open, that they're able to continue doing the work that's important to preservation, that they're able to hold on to this material. But even to another thing that I notice, there are databases that I accessed just 5 years ago that are no longer available, especially around topics such as police violence, right? You understand what's happening in this moment. So I do, on the one hand, I am excited about the possibilities when it comes to the research, but I'm also very cognizant that things are shifting, and that we will have to be creative and intentional as we look into the future to make sure that we don't lose access to all of this material.
Absolutely. I would like to, we're going to open up for questions. So if you have a question, just let us know. We'll walk around with the mic. Can you talk about the afterward? Because when I got to the end, I was very moved by chapter 8 and how you bring it into a very contemporary space and talk about the activism that's happening currently. And then you have the afterward, which is entitled An Ongoing Fight. Can you just give the audience an idea of what the afterword meant to you and, again, where this book continues?
Yes. There were so many things going through my mind when I was writing this last chapter. As you can imagine, writing a book on this topic, I could have easily added several more chapters, but at a practical level, I had a word count, and I needed to be mindful of that. So I needed to get to the point. But as I reflected on the aftermath, one of the things that I thought about was just what's happening in this contemporary moment around Black women's leadership, around Black women's human rights advocacy. We do see so many connections between past and present. In that last section, I talk about Ayo, formerly Opal Tometi, who you all know as one of the founders of Black Lives Matter. And I talk about her speaking before the United Nations, and just intentionally because it's a moment that connects so powerfully to many of the stories that I tell in the book. I could see the connection to Mary McLeod Bethune. I could hear in Tometi's words just the echoes of Ida B. Wells and so many others. And I emphasized it to really make, I think, a larger point, which is to say that the struggle for human rights is ongoing. I think it's important to recognize that. I mentioned earlier the wins. We always feel great about that, but there's so many, I think, moments where we feel like we've accomplished something, and so now we can just move on to other things. But what this book, I think, helps us see is that we can't move on. Human rights has to be something that we continue to fight for and insist on. It's just a fact. And I think when you read that last chapter, it becomes quite clear to you that yes, we may have made progress in certain ways, but we're still dealing with similar challenges. And you can hear that in the voice of Ayo Tometi when she's speaking in the aftermath of the police shooting of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile and so many others. And I intentionally end there because, of course, I knew that it would cause readers to reflect on George Floyd as an example, to bring it up to a more contemporary moment.
So we will have a mic that's going to pass around. So if you have a question, we can pass around. We'll start here in the front.
I have a question. why did you want to put this amazing picture of Fannie Lou Hamer on this book particularly?
Yeah, because that's actually a really important question. Thinking about how you decide the covers. You know,
Yes.
if Elizabeth Catlett is on the cover, is this Elizabeth Catlett on the cover
Yes,
of
yes.
No Fear?
Absolutely.
And I just thought it was such a striking pose. So pose, that's not the word I meant. Well, you know, it's such a striking cover. Yeah, how do you decide the art? Is that something you're part of? Whether it's Fannie Lou
Somewhat
Hamer
a part of, I will say. So with the Fannie Lou Hamer book, I remember as I was writing it, and of course, that photo is an iconic photo. I said to the press initially, I said, "This is what I want on the cover." And the team came back to me and said, "No, we don't think it's going to work." I thought, oh gosh. So I said, "All right, well, show me what you have in mind. And if it's better than this, then I'll be happy to consider it." Well, they kept looking, and I came back and said, "You know what? We're going to use that photo." It sounds like a plan. So it worked out for me. Sometimes it doesn't always work, but in this case, it did. So Without Fear, I really didn't even know what direction the press would go. And they said to me, "Well, we'll send you some mock-ups and tell us what you like." And so they sent me several images for the cover. And when I saw this particular one, I thought, this is it. This is it. I'd never seen it before, but the colors, immediately I thought about the American flag. I thought that would be significant for someone looking at it because I am talking about Black women in the U.S., but I'm speaking about them right far beyond the borders of the U.S. I just love this image of this Black woman on the cover. It seemed to connect so powerfully to the title. So I really do give Norton credit, as I do give Beacon credit for the cover for Until I Am Free. I'm grateful that in both cases they just did a remarkable job.
And even the history of Elizabeth Catlett, she is such an international,
Yes.
powerful Black woman. Yes. So, do we have any other questions in the audience? We'll pass around the mic. Awesome.
Oh, good. I don't have to walk. I love it. Yeah. So, one question I have, since this is taking place in Washington, D.C., where we have police state and maybe a reboot on police state. You talk about, I hope I say her name, Kadi Diallo, the murder in New York, Giuliani during that time. Her bravery and willing to challenge the status quo. And it's always been this tension between the police, our young Black men, especially our young people of color, Black and Latino. And now we're here where we're seeing this played out under this threat. So I thought it was particularly moving, and I'll get to my question, but I just want to frame it. Particularly moving when you talk about what happened in New York. And then I really just drew a juxtaposition between Giuliani,
Right.
who we thought he was, voted America's mayor at one time, and now who we see as. And now we see Washington, D.C. And now we see the attempts at ICE going through Chicago and the Midway assault, which was a American Indian name for trampling Indians through a war of Midway that happened in Illinois and then Tennessee. I'd love to hear you contextualize all of that with what's happening now and the whole Kadi Diallo sad incident with her son and what you see now. Because I feel like this book is really speaking in several ways from when you wrote it to what's happening now. Yeah. I'm going to shut up now. Thank you.
Thank you. And I was not initially sure if I would include this chapter in the book. There were moments where I thought, well, maybe it's best to put this in a different project. But I ultimately, it's actually through a conversation with Kadi Diallo. So I'll just take a step back and explain, just because I don't want to assume everyone knows who we're talking about. Many of you might be familiar with the case of Amadou Diallo. He was tragically gunned down in 1999, February 1999, by New York City police officers. 4 officers were patrolling. They were from an anti-crime unit. They said they spotted him outside his building. According from their point of view, they said that he resembled a suspect that they were looking for, a rape suspect. A rape had occurred about 9 months earlier in the area, and they said he resembled the suspect. Amadou Diallo had relocated to the United States. Had only been in the country for a short time. He had come from work, and it's not entirely clear why he was out that evening. He may have been trying to get something to eat, but he was doing nothing wrong. He was really just living his life, really minding his business. And these officers approached. There are conflicting reports, as there always is, but according to the NYPD, they said that he reached for something and they thought it was a gun, and they shot at him. They shot at him 41 times. 19 bullets entered his body. He was dead. Of course, he was dead. And by the time the investigation happens and what's determined, well, the only thing he had on him was his wallet. So if indeed he was reaching for anything, would have been reaching for his wallet. But I talk about this case in the book, and I talk about it through the eyes of Amadou Diallo's mother. I was very interested in this case. It's something that really stayed with me. So I grew up primarily in Brooklyn, and I was very young at the time when the shooting occurred. But I do remember, it just stayed with me. I remember the pain, the trauma, certainly the activism, the response from the community. All of that was in the back of my mind. So by the time I get to writing this book and I'm thinking about these concerns, I ended up reaching out to Kadi Diallo to see if she would talk to me, and she agreed to talk to me. So as we're having one of our conversations, I asked her the question, what compels you to do the kind of work you're doing? Because she's been involved in all kinds of interesting projects, human rights advocacy. And she says, well, I had to, because when I'm talking about police violence or I'm talking about state-sanctioned violence broadly, it's a human rights issue. Yeah. And I just, that stayed with me, that line. And I said, okay, there's no way this is separated from this book. It is very central to this book. And part of it was being able to show that the struggle against state-sanctioned violence, the challenges that, the efforts to bring an end to police violence and brutality, that it's not separate from all of these larger issues. So when people talk about human rights, sometimes they're interested in talking about a right to quality education, quality healthcare. All of that matters. But I thought it would be key to actually also add to this conversation the right to be able to live freely and to not have to worry about police violence and brutality, right? And so this comes up in that chapter, and her story is particularly important to, I think, for thinking about this moment, because she comes from Guinea, and the way she explains it to me, she was not very interested in politics. She just came because she got a call. It said, your son has been killed. You've got to come. And she showed up, and her life was never the same. And she connected with activists in New York, and then the rest is history. And to this very day, she's involved in this kind of work. And so she's been interested in seeking justice for her son, certainly, but also trying to make a difference in the lives of so many others. So all that is to say that I think sometimes we get into this kind of framework where we separate issues, right? And I've had people say to me, well, that's a separate thing. But what is clear in the book is, no, it's not separate. It may not be the thing that a lot of people may want to talk about. It may make you feel uncomfortable or whatever the case may be, but it's actually not separate. And as she points out, it is a human rights abuse, a violation that her son endured, and so many others have. So I think to the current context, I think it helps to pull all the pieces together. I spoke about New York in the book, but absolutely we can see the connections to DC and other cities across the nation.
We'll take this last question. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Blain. Thank you for being here, and thank you for all of your work. The question that I have for you is about actually doing the work. particularly in times when there are so many violations of human rights happening in real time. So I have a friend who is on a university fellowship right now, and she was like, last week she really couldn't do anything. She was like, all I'm doing is finding myself like doom scrolling. I'm not doing the work that I was sent here to do. And she just really couldn't find herself to do anything. And I understood that because when I was in graduate school from 2012, we started with Trayvon Martin's killing, and then, Eric Gardner, Mike Brown, Sandra Bland. So from 2012 to 2015, it was hard to get work done in grad school too. Because you're writing about oppression in a historical context from a long time ago, right, but you're actually living it at the same time. Yeah. So how do you balance doing that? Like, what kind of advice can you give to people who are trying to do this work?
This is a great question, and when I was writing the book on Fannie Lou Hamer, I was going through exactly what you described. I really struggled because as I wrote the book, it felt too real, right? It just felt too real. Some people have said to me, well, when you wrote that book, it's about Hamer, but then you start the chapters with contemporary development. Why do you start a chapter with Sandra Bland when you're talking about Hamer traveling throughout the South? And I'm like, well, if you have to ask, then you kind of missed the point, right? Yeah. And but in that process of writing the book, I will admit it was the first time I decided I do have to seek out a therapist, quite frankly. And it was kind of, I think in so many of our communities, there is a bit of stigma around this notion that, and especially too, I would say for Black women, we're strong, we can take on the world and we don't need help. But I really felt the weight of the world on my shoulder. It was the first time I made that decision, and it was the best decision I made because I realized that even in the process of just doing the research and writing, that it's a traumatic experience too. Yeah. And I don't know how many researchers really reflect on that, and I don't know, there isn't a lot of discussion about self-care in any, I think, meaningful way in the academy. We often don't talk about how we feel. We don't often talk about the pain connected to the work that we do, and especially because, I think within the field of history, there's a sense of, well, we have to be objective, and we're somewhat far removed from our subjects. Well, I can't be far removed from this subject. It just doesn't happen because it affects me too deeply. And so, at a practical level, it was important for me to be talking to people, to professionals, to make sure that I was actually able to get up to do the work and that I didn't allow it to consume me. And so at a practical level, I do say to researchers, especially those who are sometimes writing about just such heavy topics, you cannot simply do it and keep going and never stop to make sure that you are getting professional help and support. So that is one piece of advice, and I hope it resonates, and you don't have to be ashamed to say that you need it. Even if you're not sure, seek it out. I think it's important for all of us, for our mental health, and really to make sure we can keep doing this work that matters to us. So that's the biggest piece of advice I would offer.
I just want to continue to thank you for your work and your just your dedication. Throughout all of your books, the through line is making sure that the truth is told and it's accurate and it's pushing people forward. And I just deeply appreciate that. So thank you for your work.
I appreciate it.